I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists and then let them take over in the order I introduced them. Joining us today by Skype is Richard Raffault. He is Joseph Chamberlain, Professor of Legislation at Columbia Law School. Next will be Tony Goggin, who is an Associate Professor of Law at Drake University, followed by Nate Horsley, the James B. McClatchy Professor of Law at Stanford Law School. Also joining the panel today, but not listed in your program, will be John Fortier, who is the Director of the Democracy Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel. Professor Raffault.
Hey, we're working on the incoming. We're getting very, very staticky from you, so I think we're trying to fix that. Can you hear me?
We can hear you fine.
Okay. When we put it back on, okay. It's going to be a little better this way. It's very static, but on my end. But okay. I'm not quite sure what we're going to do it with. I'm thinking that I was going to enter the 21st century. Actually prepared PowerPoints, so I don't know if you can run them while I'm doing it, or I should just tweak the notes for me.
Why don't you just speak, Richard, and we'll see if we can get PowerPoints, but don't assume that people are seeing them.
Very good. So I understand that most people are talking about the future. I am focused on the past. In this, the research that I've been doing is sort of looking at what I would call the prehistory campaign finance law, before Buckley, which I have talk today will focus on campaign finance in its first century. The statutes and cases from the Jacksonian era into the middle of the 20th century. I'm curious to get your thoughts as to whether I should take it all the way up to Buckley. I think this talk today stops around 1940. Three dominant themes in this period, maybe four. One is that there was actually a lot of law, both statutes and cases, but then the three dominant themes are that the courts were generally quite deferential to legislative judgments. The dominant focus was on protecting the purity of elections, and although First Amendment type arguments, and I say type because the First Amendment itself wasn't often used, but many of these were state cases, and just about all the states had First Amendment equivalents in their constitutions. First Amendment type arguments were noted, but were given much less weight than they're given today. So the three areas, I'm going to talk about two areas primarily, and a little bit on the third, are three areas which have gotten a lot of attention in the modern era, which are regulation of corporations, spending limits, and independent committees. And going back, the oldest law that I found, I can't say that it's the oldest law that's out there, is a law from adopted in New York in 1829 to preserve the purity of elections, which has certain specific prohibitions on spending, mostly about entertainment of the voters, what was then called treating, and efforts to get voters to the polls. And then there's a blanket provision that made it a misdemeanor to contribute any money for any other purpose intended to promote an election of any particular person or ticket, except for the expenses of printing and the circulation of votes, handbills, and other papers previous to such election. This law was the focus of two big pre-Civil War decisions in New York. Both of them actually were quite similar in their facts. First case decided in 1843, go to the 1840 presidential election. The election of Tippecanoe and Tyler II. Tippecanoe was William Henry Harrison. He was actually our first log cabin president. And to support his campaign, supporters put up a log cabin on Broadway in New York as a way of touting the campaign. And that was their challenge as a violation of the ban on spending money to support a campaign. And the New York courts agreed. The defenders of Harrison made the argument that this was not corrupt, and that the statute should only apply to the contribution of money for corrupt purposes. And the court responds, this is a lower court, which is ultimately affirmed by the state's highest court. The statute says nothing about corruption. The legislature evidently thought that the most effectual way to preserve the purity of election was to keep them free from the contaminating influence of money. They said, you may contribute money to pay for printing and circulating votes and information, but not for any other purpose. And the court concludes, I will not discuss the policy of the law. The legislature has said that the thing shall not be done, and that is enough. In some ways, this case, Jackson versus Walker, 1843, pretty much captures the early modern approach. Purity of elections is the main thing. Money is a danger, not just corruption in the technical sense, but more broad than that, and that the policy is largely the legislature. The later case in 1858 involved a very similar set of facts involving the use of a tent to promote the campaign of John C. Fremont in the 1856 presidential election. And this was a case in which the person who had rented the land and the tent to the campaign wanted to get paid. The court in this case said it would be okay to pay that person because he was only providing commercial service and was not actually contributing to the campaign. But then in dictum, kind of contrasted what the landowner and tent provider did with the campaign itself. And the key language I liked in this opinion, again relying on that New York law, is funds contributed by the members of a political party upon the eve of an election are quite likely to be devoted to questionable and reputable uses, to purposes of demoralization and corruption, and thus to defeat a free and fair expression of the popular will. The contribution and collection of such funds for such purposes justly deserve the censure and condemnation of a wise and virtuous community. At that point, I just that sort of sets the stage. The next real issue is where money is coming from. And just in the paper, I sort of briefly note that prior to the 1880s, most of the money came from the patronage assessments on government employees. There's an interesting note that one of the most famous people who paid this assessment was Herman Melville, he of Moby Dick fame, who was the deputy inspector number 75 for the U.S. Customs Service on the Hudson River, and paid Hudson River Piers in New York, and paid 2% of his salary to the Republican Party. Federal law begins to restrict this in 1867 and 1876. Supreme Court upholds that in 1882. And so, all assessments, although never quite limited. Okay, I'm getting a statement that there's an internet loss. Can you hear me? Are we still going, or am I gone?
We lost you for a moment, but you're back. So keep going.
Oh, keep going? Okay. So I'm going to look at campaign funding in the Gilded Age, and I just give you a paper that has just a couple of fun quotes. In 1886, fun for those of us who do election law, statement by then former President Rutherford B. Hayes, Republican, that we're at the stage of having that this is no longer a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. It is a government by the corporations, of the corporations, and for the corporations. Seems like a rather contemporary theme. And then a statement by President Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, in his fourth annual message to Congress in 1888, a warning that corporations, which should be the carefully restrained creatures of the law and the servants of the people, are fast becoming the people's master. Okay. Just one quick quote. I'll skip over the quotes from the robber barons. Jay Gould and H.O. Havemeyer, basically making the point that they give money to whoever was in power because their major point was to maintain themselves in power. It wasn't about ideology, it was about influence. Then just sort of going forward, we begin to have regulation begins, there's more regulation, I'm zipping along here, more regulation still. The main dominant theme of regulation in this period, there are a lot of spending limits. Given the modern Supreme Court's objection to spending limits, it is striking to note that as of 1911, there were spending limits for congressional elections. There were, by the 1930s, 39 states had adopted spending limits in their elections, and there were repeated congressional investigations of high levels of spending in both presidential and Senate races. And most strikingly, there were three times in the 1920s, the U.S. Senate blocked the seating of people who won Senate races on the grounds that they spent too much money, and in two cases, they actually didn't seat the senator. The most famous one is Truman Newberry of Michigan, whose case goes to the Supreme Court. It's the Newberry case in which the Supreme Court says that the federal law limiting spending in Senate elections can't be applied to primaries, and Newberry was a primary. Newberry's spending used to be committed of a primary. Ultimately, the Senate votes to seat Newberry by a vote of 46 to 41, but in so doing also passes a resolution, which is worth reading, stating the expenditure of such excessive sums, in that case it was about $200,000, in behalf of a candidate, either with or without his knowledge. One of the big issues in the case was whether or not he was being funded by an independent committee, again something of modern significance, either with or without his knowledge or consent, being contrary to sound public policy, harmful to the dignity, honor, and dignity of the Senate, and dangerous to the perpetuity of a free government. Such excessive expenditures are hereby severely condemned and disapproved. And then subsequently, again, the two winners of two different Republican Senate primaries in 1926, William Baer of Pennsylvania and Frank Smith of Illinois, both were ultimately denied seats in the U.S. Senate on grounds of excessive spending. To quote Senator George Norris, the senatorial toga has been put on the auction block. In terms of how the spending limits did in courts, there were no federal cases. Most of the state cases upheld them, finding them that they were intended to prevent, in the words of the Idaho Supreme Court in 1910, preventing the debauching of the electorate. The most extensive treatment is one by the Wisconsin Supreme Court in 1930, which linked together modern themes of anti-corruption, equality, and participation. I'm almost done, about 2 more minutes past the deadline, in which the court emphasized that the evident purpose of the act, Wisconsin spending limit, it was not involving the race for governor, is to free the candidate from the temptation to accept support on such terms and to place candidates during this period upon a basis of equality so far as their personal ambitions are concerned. The act seeks to throw democracy back upon itself and so induce spontaneous political action in place of that which is produced by powerful political and group organizations. Again, so we see themes of corruption, equality, and participation. And then to quote the court, the political theory which underlies this law may or may not be sound. It certainly cannot be said to be unreasonable. The court recognizes a free speech argument under the Wisconsin Constitution, noting that the right of free speech and its cognate right, the right of free assembly, are rights guaranteed to the citizens of the state by our Constitution. These rights, like all other constitutional rights, are subject to reasonable regulation. If the amount which may be expended by a candidate for purposes designated as proper by the statute is so small as to prevent the proper appeal to the electorate, the remedy lies with the legislature, not with the courts. I'll talk briefly about limits on corporations, which were adopted at this time in response to a widespread concern about the dominance of corporations in elections. Just 2 points. One is many of the early cases basically dismissed corporate campaign spending as ultra vires, including decisions by the Montana Supreme Court and New York Times Court, which labeled campaign contributions as foreign to the charter purposes of the corporation. Others basically said that corporations, not being voters, have no right to participate in the elected franchise. 2 of the big cases, interestingly, involved corporate spending in the context of ballot proposition. One of the big cases in the context of a ballot proposition. Both of the big cases of this period involved corporations involved in brewing. This was the period when prohibition was coming on, and wet versus dry races were very important in many states. And one of these cases is a federal case in which a federal district court upholds the application of the Tillman Act, the federal law that prohibits corporate campaign contributions, as necessary, as appropriate to prevent the concerted use of money in corrupting the elector and debauching the election. I'll wrap up by saying I have a couple of cases dealing with the regulation of independent spending. Again, prohibition was a big issue in this time. One of the big cases coming out of New York in the 1920s involved the Anti-Saloon League, which could be described as a 501c3 organization before its time, in which a New York court acknowledged that many activities in connection with elections are educational, but their motive is to affect the result and to aid or defeat candidates or propositions submitted for a decision by the ballot box, and thus they need to be subject to disclosure requirements. I'll wind up by asking you all 3 questions, which I'd be curious to get your answers. One is how far forward I should take this, and in particular should I begin to look at how the courts dealt with the encounter with the First Amendment. I stopped around 1940. The First Amendment used to be a factor in the late 1940s and 1950s. And second, so the 2 questions. Is this any of this relevant today? Is this a kind of a road not taken? Is it useful to remind ourselves that we had a very different set of perspectives on campaign finance before the 1940s and 1970s? Is this purely antiquarian, or does this have any contemporary relevance? Thanks.
Mr. Gotti? Thank you very much, and it is truly an honor to be here. On the night of June 17, 1972, Washington Metropolitan Police arrested 5 burglars in the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office building. It
was the beginning of the most famous political scandal in American history, ultimately leading to President Richard Nixon's resignation from office in August 1974. The Watergate scandal shined a light on dark secrets of the American campaign finance system. During its Watergate investigation, the FBI discovered that the Nixon administration had received illegal corporate campaign contributions from, among others, American Airlines, Goodyear, Chrysler, Anheuser-Busch, and Disney. The Nixon administration used illegal and legal contributions to fund a massive advertising onslaught against the Democratic nominee, George McGovern. But the Nixon administration also used campaign funds to finance the Watergate break-in, as well as to secretly bribe the arrested burglars to keep quiet and not cooperate with federal prosecutors. Not surprisingly, therefore, as the Watergate cover-up unraveled, the scandal crystallized in the public mind the notion that large campaign contributions are inherently corrupting. In October 1974, 2 months after Nixon resigned from office, President Gerald Ford signed into law sweeping amendments to the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971. Among other things, the 1974 amendments established limits on contributions to candidates and parties, placed a cap on total campaign expenditures by federal candidates, restricted independent campaign expenditures to $1,000 per individual, and established the Federal Election Commission to enforce federal election law. But as it turned out, the most important campaign finance development of the Watergate era came in the Supreme Court. In the 1976 case of Buckley v. Vallejo, the justices upheld FECA's limits on individual contributions to candidates and parties. The court ruled that the battle against corruption justified restrictions on campaign contributions. Momentously, however, the Buckley court also struck down the caps on overall expenditures by parties and candidates. The court held that the restrictions on total spending violated the First Amendment rights of freedom of speech and association. Thus, in the aftermath of Buckley, the post-Watergate campaign finance model has been characterized by 2 key features: low contribution limits on parties and candidates, but no overall expenditure caps. We now have 40 years of experience with the post-Watergate campaign finance system. That gives us sufficient evidence to ask, and I think answer, a fundamental historical question. Are we better off today than we were before the Watergate-era campaign finance reforms? In my view, the answer to that question is no. In fact, in many respects, the current system is worse than the system that prevailed before Watergate. And although many place the blame on the 2010 case of Citizens United, the FEC, most of the failings in our campaign finance system were apparent long before Citizens United. As a direct result of the Buckley decision, we never charted a clear course between regulation or deregulation in the post-Watergate era. FECA and Buckley left us with a hybrid system, a Frankenstein monster of mismatched laws, some that regulate campaign contributions and others that deregulate them. The result is a deeply dysfunctional system that gives us the worst consequences of regulation and deregulation without the benefits of either. The dysfunctional nature of our post-Watergate system manifests itself in several ways. First, the Watergate reforms failed to achieve their principal goal of reducing the role of money in politics. Indeed, by striking down expenditure limits, the Buckley court ensured that the floodgates remained open. Although many blame Citizens United for our billion-dollar campaigns, the fact is American election spending began to surge long before Citizens United. For example, the 2000 election cost $3 billion, the 2004 election cost $4 billion, and the 2008 election exceeded $8 billion. Accounting for inflation, presidential campaign costs in 2008 in real dollar terms were about 4 times higher than in 1972, the year of the Watergate break-in. Again, this increase predated Citizens United. Second, the Watergate reforms not only failed to control money in politics, they had the paradoxical and deeply pernicious consequence of dramatically increasing the amount of time that politicians needed to spend raising money. FECA's low caps on private donations to candidates, which Buckley upheld, placed federal candidates on a grueling fundraising treadmill in which they must constantly raise millions of dollars in increments of $2,700 or less. To be sure, campaign money has always been important in campaigns. As the Ohio political operative Mark Hanna declared in 1896, there are two things that are important in politics. The first is money, and I can't remember what the second is. But prior to FICA's amendments, politicians weren't required to raise massive amounts of money in absurdly small quantities. Yes, they were bankrolled by wealthy special interests. But because they were permitted to quickly raise large amounts of money from a handful of wealthy political supporters, elected officials in the pre-Watergate era had time to master the issues, raise their families in Washington, D.C., and get to know their colleagues as people. That is not true today. In the post-Watergate era of low contribution limits and no expenditure caps, the average member of Congress spends most of their work week fundraising rather than attending to the business of government. For example, in 2013, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee directed that new members of Congress should spend 4 to 6 hours per day, every day, raising campaign money. In addition, members routinely fly back to their districts on weekends to fundraise. A study by the Congressional Management Foundation found that 78% of members of Congress spend at least 40 weekends each year in their home district. When you have to raise millions of dollars in increments of $2,700, you have no choice but to become a full-time professional fundraiser. The quality and nature of our public discourse is directly impacted. Lawrence Lessig points out that as the amount of time members of Congress spend fundraising has increased, the amount of time they spend in committee meetings has correspondingly declined. We should not be surprised, therefore, that our politics are characterized by gridlock, polarization, and extreme partisanship. Third, the timing of the Watergate reforms could not have been worse. Most campaign spending consists of television advertising costs. The low contribution limits, no expenditure caps model went into effect at the exact moment that television advertising became outrageously expensive. The history of television Super Bowl ads tells the story. The cost of a 30-second television ad during Super Bowl I in 1967 was $293,000 in today's dollars. By 2013, the cost of a 30-second TV ad during the Super Bowl was $3.8 million. Consequently, while the $7 billion spent on campaigning in the 2012 election outraged reformers and the general public alike, it is in fact only a fraction of the $180 billion that U.S. businesses spend annually in commercial advertising. In 2011, for example, the big three American auto companies spent nearly $14 billion on advertisements. Try raising that in $2,700 increments and see how much time you have left to get to know your colleagues and master the issues. Finally, in the years since Watergate and Buckley, Congress and the Supreme Court have made our hybrid system into an even bigger Frankenstein monster. In Citizens United and the follow-on D.C. Circuit case of Speech Now, the federal courts gave rise to super PACs, independent outside groups that are fundraising via this because they may receive unlimited contributions. Super PAC fundraising now far outstrips that of the candidates and parties. Congress itself weakened the parties further by enacting the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act of 2002, which crippled the fundraising power of political parties by banning soft money. Although the decline of political parties predates BICRA, BICRA certainly made the situation worse by depriving the parties of a key funding source. Not coincidentally, the demise of party influence has been accompanied by increasing political extremism, as powerfully evidenced by the 2016 presidential campaign. Not surprisingly, therefore, the Watergate reforms utterly failed to restore public confidence in the integrity of our political system. So what should we do? The answer to that question rests with the Supreme Court. The court created our campaign finance dysfunction, and only it can fix it. Accordingly, the next time the justices have an opportunity to revisit Buckley and Citizens United, the Supreme Court must once and for all decide a key constitutional question. Does the First Amendment permit comprehensive campaign finance regulations, or does it instead require sweeping deregulation? The justices need to give us a definitive answer to that question. To do so, they have two options. The first is to embrace deregulation wholeheartedly by extending the Citizens United decision to candidates and parties, not just super PACs. The justices could do so by striking down all contribution limits as an impermissible violation of freedom of speech and association. The court would thus make clear that the First Amendment takes precedence over efforts to fight campaign corruption or promote egalitarianism. The second option is to do the exact opposite by reversing both Citizens United and Buckley's ban on expenditure limits. The justices could overturn those decisions by ruling that the Constitution permits Congress to not only impose contribution limits in super PACs and other outside groups, but also to establish an overall cap on federal campaign spending. The court would thus make clear that principles of egalitarian democracy and the battle against corruption justify significant limits in the First Amendment. Although they involve diametrically opposed views of the Constitution, both approaches have merit. Deregulation, for example, is far from a radical idea. Several states place no limits on the amount donors may contribute to gubernatorial and legislative candidates, including blue states like Oregon, red states like Alabama, and purple states like Iowa. Those states successfully hold fair and competitive elections in a deregulated campaign finance environment. American history also belies the notion that plutocracy is the inevitable result of a deregulated campaign finance system. In the 40 years preceding FECA's effective date, April 7, 1972, there was no FEC, and the federal contribution limits and disclosure regulations on the books were essentially toothless. Yet the Wild West era of campaign finance did not lead to the super rich dominating our public policy. Instead, ironically, the largely unregulated campaign finance era of 1932 to 1972 was the most progressive era in American history. It gave us FDR's New Deal, Truman's Fair Deal, the Great Society, the Civil Rights Acts, and the highest marginal tax rates in our history. All of those major progressive reforms occurred at a time when wealthy donors could effectively make secret and unlimited campaign contributions. Nixon's presidency itself is a case in point. He took million-dollar contributions from wealthy supporters and illegal contributions from corporations. Yet, as president, Nixon imposed wage and price controls on big business, and he created the EPA, OSHA, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission. On the other hand, a completely regulated system is not a radical idea either. For instance, freedom of speech remains alive and well in Canada, even though Canadian election law imposes strict caps on campaign expenditures. In the aftermath of Watergate, the Canadian Parliament adopted the Election Expense Act of 1974, which established low expenditure limits, and they remain in place today. For example, in the October 2015 parliamentary elections just last month, the expenditure limit was about $200,000 for candidates, depending on the size of the riding, and the expenditure limit was $54 million for each of the three major parties. Crucially, Canada imposes strict contribution and spending limits not only on parties and candidates, but also on outside groups. For example, under Canadian law, it is illegal for outside groups not registered as third parties to air political ads during election campaigns. Moreover, election advertising by outside groups that register as third parties is capped at $8,800 per electoral district and $400,000 nationally. Effectively, that means there are no super PAC ads in Canadian elections. Yet, despite spending only a fraction of what the United States spends on campaign advertising, Canadians debate election issues just as robustly as Americans do, and they have fiercely competitive elections. Indeed, in the last 30 years, Canadian elections have seen far more incumbent turnover than American elections. For example, in October 2015, the Liberal Party went from third place in Parliament with only 34 seats to 184 seats in a single election. Canadians saw similar election turnover in 2011, 2005, 1993, and 1984. For example, in 1993, the governing Conservatives were reduced from 156 seats in Parliament to 2 seats in a single election. That level of incumbent turnover is unheard of in American elections. The point is, incumbents are not safe in Canadian politics. despite onerous campaign finance restrictions that our Supreme Court has thus far never permitted Congress to establish in this country. As the Canadians show, competitive elections and issue-driven campaigns are possible even in the most highly regulated campaign finance environment. The bottom line is both regulation and deregulation can work. But what doesn't work is the Supreme Court's 40-year effort to have it both ways. Ultimately, the Supreme Court must either end the war on money and politics or give reformers the tools necessary to win that war. For the long-term health of our democracy, the court cannot have it both ways any longer. It must choose, once and for all, a coherent and consistent campaign finance course for the nation to follow. Thank you very much.
Now for something completely different. We've heard about the past, I'm going to talk about the future. I don't know whether it's motivated reasoning or what, but since I moved from Amsterdam and 116th Street, which is right behind Richard's Head, there I left to Stanford, I've become interested in issues of technology and democracy, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how technological changes in political communication are affecting the campaign finance system and will affect it in the future. My sort of jumping off point is that we tend to misunderstand what Citizens United was really about. That for the most part, the way Citizens United has become a metaphor for all the problems in the campaign finance system, and it's not, and the way we talk about it is somewhat unrelated from the facts of the case itself. Citizens United, as I'll show you in a bit, was not about a corporate television ad, right? It was, and you should be forgiven for thinking that it was, given that the Supreme Court sort of interpreted it that way. But it was about a movie that was broadcast on demand and that you could download, just like you can, say, HBO on demand. And the case is really as much, if not more so, about changing the changing media as it is about corporate personhood or corporate spending in elections. And so it's a case before its time in a lot of ways because the traditional television ad, which has been the focus of our campaign finance system, will be declining in importance over the next 10 years. And other things, we'll talk about what those are in a second, will be rising as in salience as the strategy for political campaigning. All right, I'm going to mute Richard and mute our traffic. And so, whether you're talking about the rise of on-demand communication akin to Citizens United or internet ads or the like, and I'll talk about that. Once we make that transition from the 30-second ad to other kinds of internet-based communication, government regulation becomes even more difficult, all right, for reasons we'll go into. So much so that I think, and I'll make this sort of radical argument here, that we need to start thinking less about using the FEC and the government to regulate campaign communication and now start thinking about the main portals for the internet, Google, Facebook, and the like, as being almost quasi-regulators of campaign finance. That they will have the power to do things that the FEC cannot, and their terms of service will become almost more important than the laws on the books, as so much of our communication moves from television to the internet. All right, now in my role as evangelist in trying to explain what Citizens United is about, I just thought I would play the trailer to Citizens United so we can all be on the same page as to what this case really was about, if I can figure out how to do it. All right, 1 second.
Is you only remember what you like, and you forget the parts that you didn't like.
What did she follow? No, she's not going too far. She's lying. My plan does not create a single new government department, agency, or bureaucracy. I'm going to take $10 billion away from a lot of these industries.
Hillary is really the closest thing we have in America to a European She is steeped in controversy, steeped in studies.
The bigger this campaign is, the bigger the choice is, the more trouble she's in.
We must never underestimate this woman. We must never understate her chances of winning. And we must never forget the fundamental danger that this woman poses to every value that we hold dear. You see, I know her.
So let the conversation begin. I have a feeling it's going to be very interesting.
Okay, so that was just the trailer. And it was broadcast on demand, so that if you were at home, you could download the movie. It was not sort of imposed upon you like a 30-second ad, in the middle of a football game you're going to play. And as a result of the decision, as a result of the FEC's enforcement action, the movie was banned, right? Because Citizens United was a nonprofit corporation that used corporate funds, and the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act that Kane Feingold said that you cannot use corporate treasury funds for election communications within 30 days of a primary, and this was in 30 days of a primary, targeted to the relevant electorate that refers to a clearly identified candidate for public office. Okay? And Hillary Clinton was running against Barack Obama. This was then put up online, and so it was seen as a broadcast communication. This issue of the media aspect of the case did come up in the oral argument. It was actually sort of funny, really important interchange in some respects, where the acting Solicitor General was sort of raked over the coals by the Chief Justice and a few other justices in trying to get him to commit on this question. You say you're allowed, the government is allowed to ban this movie that's put on demand. What about books? Could it ban books? Could it prevent Hillary the book from being published with corporate money, since most books are published by corporations? And the Solicitor General tries to skirt around and say, well, this is not about books. And the court says, yes, I know it's not about books, but could they ban books? And he says, well, there's another part of the law that, yes, we understand. And then Justice Kennedy muses and he says, well, wait, what about that Kindle device? That's a book, right? But it's sort of broadcast communication, isn't it? Because you download it after all. Maybe that's even covered by the statute. Yeah, but this case isn't about Kindles either, Justice. We know it's not about that. And then they sort of force him after about 5 minutes to say, look, if we know the statute doesn't prevent books from being published, but is it consistent with the government's theory that you could ban the book? And the acting Solicitor General says yes. And it's at that point there's an audible intake of air in the court. What I tell my First Amendment students is, whatever you learn in this course, try not to be arguing for the Supreme Court and be on the side of book banning. That's pretty much a surefire way to conclude the case. And that sets the stage for everything that comes later. The case gets re-argued. There's a whole sort of saga about that. Then Solicitor General Elena Kagan argues it, and the like. But the point should hit you, which is that to what extent is our fear about campaign finance contingent on the technology of communication that has sort of been the focus of a regulatory effort, right? If the Koch brothers, Sheldon Adelson, George Soros, Tom Steyer, were using their money for get out the vote drives or lawn signs, would you be more or less concerned than if it's about television advertising, right? Or if they're producing movies and the like. And so you might think, as I do, that we have been sort of caught in this paradigm of television as the main problem when it comes to campaign finance, and that things are about to change. And so campaign finance is television regulation, and now how is it going to change? So the way to think about this is not that television advertising is now going to move off of television onto some other device. It's a whole sea change in the way that political communication is going to happen. So in some ways, it's the least effective way to campaign is to take just a 30-second ad and now just put it onto the internet or onto the computer. We're talking about a change in devices. This picture on the right is from a Google promotional flyer called 4 Screens to Victory, which is talking about your phone, your tablet, your computer, and your television as being avenues for political persuasion. Even video games, the Obama campaign inserted ads into video games in the last go-round, into Madden Football 15, and I think it was Brick Breaker was the other one. It's important to realize that we're not just talking about the change in devices, we're also talking about change in what television is. That it will be very difficult in the coming years to distinguish your television from your computer, right? And so this kind of on-demand programming, which was at the focus of Citizens United, is going to become the rule, not the exception. And so, especially the law students in the room and the college students even more so, they are watching very little in the way of linear programming, stuff that's broadcasted, and much more on-demand stuff on their phones and the like. And obviously, we're talking about, there's a whole, if you want to think about the categories of communication, you've got your paid media, blogs, ads, AdWords, search results, and the like, as well as unpaid media. Just look at what Donald Trump's been able to do. Perhaps the key difference between these old forms of media and the new forms are targeting, although that doesn't even quite capture. We've always had robocalls that could get you at home, or even direct mail and the like, let alone personal visits. But it's the targeting combined with the amount of information that the candidates, parties, and the portals have about you, so that you can get individually personalized ads, for example, that affect what you see in your news feed on Facebook, or what you get when you're surfing for airline tickets and the like. All right, it is very difficult once we move to the internet to regulate campaign finance, I think, and you see this last year caused a huge brouhaha at the FEC, where the Republicans accused the Democrats of trying to regulate the internet. And so politically, it really cannot be done. No regulation is going to come out of the FEC probably about anything, but certainly about this. Why is it so difficult to regulate the internet? Sort of obvious, but the geographic scope. How are you going to regulate people putting up something in a teenager in his mother's basement in Moscow puts up something about the election? You're not going to be able to regulate it here in the U.S. We're talking about a variety of media, as I said before. Anonymity is extremely sort of facilitated by online communication, and who is the media, which is always a problem in campaign finance laws, even more difficult when you start thinking about it online. Other countries do regulate. This is one, I think, either Twitter or Google's examples of regulation. So Brazil prevents promotion of political candidates or parties on the web. China prevents, well, pretty much everything. And so there are government efforts, but they obviously don't have the First Amendment we do, and I think it's even for those countries it's going to be difficult. One of the risks of this transition, besides the normal campaign finance concerns that people have, and this is not thinking about it's thinking also about problems such as polarization and the like. Concerns that Cass Sunstein and others raised about echo chambers and negativity, and again, the problems I emphasized before about anonymous spending and the like, as well as the targeting and privacy, violations of privacy that happen as a result of the data that people have. All right, here's the last point, but we'll talk about it in the Q&A. Which is that I do think we now need to start thinking about the rules that Twitter, Facebook, Google, and others are using to regulate political campaigning, and that is almost a kind of space of quasi-law that we should be thinking about reforming and like. One thing I want to emphasize, first of all, yes, these are corporations that have profit motive as their first and foremost concern, and they have great capacity for evil. Yes, conceded. They also, this is a small share of what they do, and I think in some ways they also want to find out what the right answer is. But one option, is not to not regulate this area. They will be regulating political communication. The question is whether the same standards that we use for commercial advertising should be the ones that we use for political advertising. Okay, so there are extensive regulations that they have for commercial regulations that need to be updated. They deal with things, and all of these regulations that they have would violate the First Amendment if they were passed by the government. Okay, no question about it. So whether the rules on hate speech, harassment, obscenity, and the like would violate the First Amendment. So just one last slide here, and that is, well, so what would be the terrain of regulation if we wanted them to reform? And I don't expect them to start becoming the policeman of political tone online, although there are some portals like ESPN, for example, that prevents negative attack ads on individual candidates. Okay, so they could do it if they wanted to. Obviously, government can't mandate something like that. I don't expect them to become the policeman of truth online, although that is what Google and Facebook do. On YouTube, you can't just have an ad, for example, that says Coke will cure diabetes or something like that, right? And so their rules about misrepresentation would apply to political ads as well. Where I think we have the greatest opportunity, I think, is to try to ensure that these firms promote disclosure and combat the risks of undisclosed anonymous spending on the internet, which I think is really facilitated by that technology. And then also, given the concerns that a lot of people have about the bias of these firms, that they take a strong position to make sure that they that they treat Republicans and Democrats equally and alike, and something akin to what was called the Equal Access or Fairness Doctrine communication. I'll end there, but lots to talk about. Any questions?
I'm going to pose a question. Oh, I'm sorry. If we have John and then yeah, whatever you prefer.
Sure. I will try to be brief. I was pitch hitting on this panel and it looked like Richard might not make it here. Luckily, we brought him in. I will say I looked up to Richard Burfall for many years, but I have never literally looked up to him in the way that I did today, as my neck is paying for it right now. Let me say a few things about maybe both sides, the funding side and then the technology side that actually Nate and I are engaged in the same sort of project. Just for the future, what controversies are out there and actually what possibilities for reform seem more likely today in a world that is not like the world we had back in Buckley. I guess the simple point would be we have, I think, agreement across the aisle, especially among the establishment, that the new thing that we are all thinking about in campaign finance is independent groups for a set of laws that was primarily directed to candidates and parties originally, and with subsequent court decisions, the rise in spending of independent groups is certainly of interest to people broadly. We'll come back to that in the reform side. And then I guess the other more recent development, I think, politically on thinking about what can be done about these things is that on the right, sort of a rising controversy about transparency. I think transparency was something that was thought of even 10 or 12 years ago as relatively non-controversial, something that Republicans might pose sort of limits on campaign spending, but would say, disclose money, we should know where things are coming from. Partly because of these independent groups, questions of transparency, and partly, I think, just there's a legal and political debate on the Republican side. They're less uncontroversial, more controversial. Where I think has the reform debate gone? I sketch this out in very broad terms because I think the parties are far apart. It's not likely that we see great agreement on what to do about changes in our campaign finance system. But a few notes. One, the rise in interest in small donations. That's not a brand new story, but I would say on the reformer side, those who might have traditionally come at this set of issues by thinking that there should be limits on expenditures or equalization of expenditures or public financing would be a more the tack of reform groups. The question of how the composition of the donors. While there are large donors, could we help and facilitate a broader set of donors by matching contributions or giving tax credits? And sometimes those things combined with accepting voluntarily limits. That's a change, I think, on the reformer side, that it's not simply, or at least it goes against the idea of there's simply just too much money. Recognition that either it's impractical to regulate them legally, or that just campaigns need a certain number of amount of money to get the word out. That the interest in broadening who is giving and small donations is potentially part of the story. I think the bigger issue, which is getting some play, interestingly, on both sides, is this question of the independent groups and their relation to political parties. Certainly at the more elite level, you find on both the Republican and Democratic side worries about these independent groups. Now, what do we do about them? How do we regulate them? The court makes certain regulations much more difficult. But are the parties at a disadvantage? Could the parties be helped out in a way, either through making it easier for them to compete by raising funds with these independent groups, or with some of the actions that they have today, the ability to coordinate with their candidates and other restrictions that are sometimes placed on them. And I guess I would say, this is probably a little bit more of a concern of the right. The Republicans might propose things like raising limits on amounts you can give to parties, taking off certain restrictions on them. But you've seen some interesting moves on the left with the Brennan Center report and several columnists who have sort of made the case that, look, parties and candidates, but parties in particular are responsible actors. We know where the money is going. Not all the money in going to third-party groups is disclosed. We can hold parties more accountable than we can these independent groups. That maybe there's a way in which we find funding mechanisms or take off restrictions on parties to allow them to compete more with independent groups. So while I don't foresee a great kumbaya moment of reform between the parties in many ways, there are some areas that I do think that there is a potential confluence of interest. And those are the areas, unless we see a court change, I think maybe people hope for a change in the court, a broad change in the direction of our legal landscape. Those are the kinds of issues that, given our current landscape, might get some play. Let me quickly turn to Nate's enterprise again, which I will admit being involved in and thinking Nate is really on the right track of that what is happening now with the migration of advertising and interest to other platforms than just television advertising is really going to open up this whole new world, and all of the issues that Nate has listed right here on this panel are interesting. How do we deal with disclosure? How do we deal with fairness, inaccuracy in ads? All have to be sort of rethought, and probably at the platform level and not at the regulatory level. I guess I wanted to reiterate, I think what Nate indicated was the difference between the old world, which really was a very literally broadcast world, a broad world where you put an ad that was seen by many but was not well targeted, and the new world, which is meant to find specific groups of voters and target a message to them. That is the future. And it's here now, and we're doing it in a lot of ways. But I guess I think one other thing that we should note is that there are some constraints on this, and I think in theory, right now, certainly an internet digital ad, or even some cable ads could be targeted directly to you, not just to a group. You sitting in your home, watching a show or looking at a website, and the neighbor is looking at the same one, and you are getting different ads, and they know they can hit you at X time with X message. But there are some constraints on this, and I guess we've been struck by the digital people on both sides of the aisle who deal with these issues. One, that breadth still matters. You can target all you want, but if you can get down to figuring out which shows, who watches Animal Planet, I'm going to get X number of Republicans. I can go to your characteristics, things we know about you from a voter file, and go right at you. But there are a lot of people that can't be reached, and you're not sure you're not missing people around the margins. And there still is an argument for breadth and big ads, and not just the narrowest targeting of them. Secondly, there is the interesting questions platforms face themselves. If you're a platform, do you want to allow a party or a candidate to target the individual level? Or are you more comfortable telling them, I'm going to kind of get this group of people? If you
John, can you wrap up as soon as you could?
Yeah, I've got two more points, quick. But do they want to get to the individual level, or do they want to, as somebody online, do you feel comfortable with an ad that looks like it was made just for you, or are you more comfortable having a little bit of space between you and what's coming at you? Google doesn't want you to feel uncomfortable. And then last thing is just how practical it is to target. As much as you can go down to the individual level, you still have to make ads for people. You still have to spend time. And it isn't worth a campaign's efforts to target 20 people or 30 people or 50 people. So I think the targeting world is very important, but I guess I don't want to say that we're going to move completely away from the world of broad broadcast, or at least large groups that we target.
Okay, so we have very limited time left. What I'm going to do is ask a question for each of the panelists. I'm going to ask all three at once and just let them go in order, and then turn it over to you. And let me just beseech the panelists' indulgence in being as brief as you can in your answers. So first, for Richard, I'm going to ask you to answer the question you asked. What's the relevance of this history to contemporary debates over campaign finance? For Tony, another question that's provoked by your own talk. Which way do you think is better? Should the court deregulate campaign finance completely, or should it get out of the business of superintending regulations? And for Nate, the question, if your premise is right, if these private companies are the new regulators, how should we regulate them? Should we, for example, maybe reinvigorate the Marsh versus Alabama doctrine and consider them to be state actors performing a public function? I'm going to unmute you now, Richard, and let's hope we can hear you. Richard, can you hear me? No. Okay, so let me go to Tony then.
Sure. In my view, the advantage of deregulation is the fact that it's obviously the path of least resistance. It's the easiest to do. Congress could do it unilaterally right now. But it's also by far the most unpopular. Surveys show what 85% of the American people want comprehensive campaign finance reform. So assuming that we actually were to adopt a Canadian-style system, what I think we would find is, although our Supreme Court jurisprudence focuses on free speech, as I indicated in the paper, I really think Canadians debate issues at least as robustly as we do, and arguably I think they actually cover a lot more issues because our 30-second TV ads tend to suck the oxygen out of a more well-rounded debate, and we end up focusing on birth certificates or walls or whatever the case might be. My concern with the adoption of a Canadian system here is I fear politically motivated prosecutions by both parties because there will always be gray zones when it comes to what counts as an expenditure. And I think Canadians have a much more restrained and balanced political culture than we have right now in an era of such intense political polarization. The Pew Research Center has been tracking this over several decades. So I would argue if we are going to adopt a Canadian-style regulatory approach in some post-Buckley Supreme Court 10 or 20 years down the road, I think what we would have to be very careful about is the possibility that government enforcers on both sides could become politicized.
So I am afraid of the power that obviously Google and some of these big Facebook have over our lives in politics. But in thinking about whether you constitutionalize them as state actors, a lot of problems result, because I can only go into this in brief. But it's not just Google and Facebook and Twitter. You have to start thinking about Amazon and Netflix and Apple and also the cable companies, because and it's very difficult to describe. I use the word portal in my description, but it's almost that's just a shorthand for the people who can deliver content. And then it's also Google's power is not just through, say, their search engine and the like, because most of what Google's sort of market power is in this area is driven by is their capacity to put ads on about 80% of the internet. So when you end up surfing another site, you end up getting an ad that's placed there by Google based on your search history and the like. And so it's very difficult to even define what that state actor would be, even if we wanted to constitutionalize it. But I mean, the bottom line is, this is an opportunity for reformers to actually lobby these companies that have great power to try and have them do things the government can't.
Okay, so let's go to Richard. Mandy, you're going to cue him. Richard, you're unmuted. He's got the question.
I don't know, what is the question? I can't hear you.
Can you hear me, Richard? No. Okay.
You have to talk into the microphone.
Okay. I'm talking into any microphone I can see here. So,
Bend down. Lower your head. Oh, bend down. Not too far down. Up a little bit.
all right.
Now I can hear you.
Great. Question is, answer your own question.
And I can also become your dentist.
What's the relevance of all this history to the contemporary debate?
Oh, that's my question to you.
I'm turning it right back on you, Richard.
Well, that's why I want to get the remarks of distinguished scholars like yourselves. I suppose the relevance of history could be, as is captured by the title of the talk, which I'm not sure I gave, which is The Past is a Foreign Country, is just as foreign countries have very different campaign finance rules. Foreign countries we consider to be democratic, countries with free speech, countries with regular changes over political parties like, say, Canada or the United Kingdom or France, have very different rules, often more restrictive, with a much smaller role given to their courts. The United States was a democracy in the period between 1836, 1829, and 1940, with regular elections and frequent turnover of political parties and new parties formed and collapsing. And somehow we survived with a very, very different approach to campaign finance law. Democracy seemed to flourish. Now, it could be, you could argue that the problem was these laws, that the reason we were able to flourish is these laws were not effectively enforced. And so maybe you can afford to have more restrictive doctrines, rules and doctrines on the books if they're not enforced. That's a possibility. But it does seem to me that within the American past, not that distant past, you could have flourishing democracy in which there was in which the legislature or the political process played the dominant role in setting the rules, in which concerns like equality and prevention of corruption broadly defined, not just the quid pro quo, could be the driving forces, and which courts took not no role, but a more modest role. And somehow it was a democratic system, and shows that that's possible in our system too.
Thank you. So, here's what I'm going to do given the limited time that we have. I'm going to collect questions and put them up for grabs. I don't think Richard's going to be able to hear him, so I've got him muted. But if you've got questions, raise them and try to keep them brief. Raise your hand and try to keep them brief. Yes, ma'am. You.
So my question is, okay, so my question is that given what we're talking about regulating entities and then we're talking about targeting, so aside from that, how exactly does that affect the voters' information that they do access as opposed to the linear mediums?
More questions?
With respect to any of the different types of regulation that we discussed, I guess my question is how do you get there? Because I don't see Congress as having very much incentive to change the rules of the game right now.
Given the self-selecting nature of the internet and the fact that Google bases the ads you see on your prior search history, what role does fairness play? There are websites that I would never ever go to, and political advertisers for a diametrically opposed commercial or political advocate would likely advertise there. And likewise, there are websites that my cousin, who is politically diametrically opposed to me, would never go to and would never want to see the ads that I would see on a regular basis. And what role does Google or Kindle or Amazon or anybody have in trying to apply the fairness doctrine that has previously applied to TV at the time on the major networks?
One last question in the front.
Do you envision the Supreme Court in the future endorsing the time-saving rationale for legislators in view of how much of their day, week, and month is being taken up with fundraising and directly detracting from their ability to actually do their job?
Okay, jump ball. Who wants to go first?
Well, since most of it's here, let me stab at that. So, what's the effect on voter information? Well, now you find that young people, interesting thing, it's actually now not young, the let's say 20 to 30 year olds get most of their political information, or a disproportionate for sure amount of their political information through Facebook in one way or another, so that, because that is the launch pad for them to access political information. There's a recent study on that. And so depending on the uniformity of your friends and the like, you will get echo chamber effects from the type of news that you will get from the stuff that appears in your news feeds. And so that's a real concern. And for those who are interested, I published a piece on this a few weeks ago in the American Interest magazine, so you can download online, where I talk a little bit about Cass Sunstein's idea, which goes a little bit to your question about, should we have the ability to sort of, when you're looking at one website, to at least have some other voice there to say, hey, there's this alternative point of view. Now, look, I don't think any of that is going to happen. The FCC is not going to regulate fairness online. And when I was talking about fairness before, I just meant equal access, because there is a concern that Google, Facebook, and the like may discriminate against one party more than another, one type of group more than another. One thing I should say, and this goes to what John was saying, all of the centrifugal tendencies that we see now and polarizing tendencies from in our politics generally, the rise of cable, become even more problematic when you start looking at the internet, in part because at least candidates are advantaged in the television world, because candidates and parties can get the lowest unit rate on advertising. That's not true when it comes to the internet. Everybody is treated the same. And so the more accountable, and this is one of the stories from the 2012 election, is that, and for that matter, this election, when you see what's happening with Jeb Bush's campaign, which is that the super PACs end up having to spend sometimes 4 times as much for any given advertisement on television that a candidate's campaign would have to. But when it comes to online advertising, they're all treated the same, and so that even the sort of candidate speech favoring policies that we have for television would then be eradicated when we move online.
Tony or John?
Well, nobody took on the time for candidates question. I do think that if you want to find some bipartisan agreement, if you talk to former members of Congress, they will universally across both sides of the aisle say, hey, we spent too much time raising money. Much harder to get to how you fix that and what they agree on. I mean, broadly speaking, some of the rights would think, well, raise the limits. As Tony was hinting at that, have raised bigger chunks, you wouldn't have to spend as much time. Other restrictions, things like state legislatures who say you can only raise money at times where the legislature's not in session. I'm not sure we're going to go that route, just because I think it's the political class thinks it's not a good aspect of their job. The reforms don't seem to be widely agreed on.
And the Supreme Court rejected in Randall versus Sorrell for what it's worth. I mean, but then again, I think we're talking about a potential another Supreme Court where they would.
Tony, you get the last word.
Sure. In response to the question of how do we get there, I think if you're in the reform community, the emphasis clearly the last several years has been on trying to find a workaround Buckley. And I think in the long run that may prove to be a mistake, because you're still stuck with, if you don't have an expenditure cap, advertising costs skyrocket every single year. And so a lot of people in this room have been really intelligent critiques of Buckley's ruling on the expenditure caps. And I think it would behoove the reform community to revive the direct attack on Buckley, not because it's going to change the minds of 5 people on the Supreme Court right now, but 4 justices are over the age of 75. Same-sex marriage in 2000, nobody would have thought that in 2015 you would have had Obergefell. I don't think Buckley is permanently enshrined in our jurisprudence, but I do think that academics play a very important role in tilling the ground for the justices in advance. And so I guess my advice to reformers would be, I think it's worth it to cite, as Richard said as well, Britain and Canada and other countries that have robust free exercise of free speech, even in a system that has very low expenditure caps.
Please join me in thanking the panelists.